Hi, welcome to this video. I seek to set out this video a sort of context to understand the importance of pluralist economics and a sense of what economics is about and why pluralism is so important.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first CSEP talk for this year. I'm introducing Henry Leveson-Gower, who has been a practicing economist and policy analyst for almost 25 years. He's the founder of Promoting Economic Pluralism and editor of The Mint. Henry.
Thanks very much, Charlie, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm standing on this important stage in a Cambridge lecture theatre, and not even academic, don't even have a PhD, so I'll see how it goes. I was just thinking, economic pluralism or pluralist economics is a very sort of geeky term, isn't it? I was actually, the driver in the taxi that I got, thanks very much, said, you going to see anyone interesting speak? And I sort of said, well, yeah, I'm speaking actually. He said, oh yeah, okay, well, I'm sure you'll be interesting. What are you talking about? I said, economic pluralism. He said, what's that? Is there an ointment for that? What I'm going to try and do, or to make the attempt to do, this isn't geeky at all. It may sound it, and that's maybe a problem that we have to address. But it's really about something quite fundamental. I think it's economic pluralism for me it's more like a social movement, more akin to feminism, transgender recognition, the gay movement. It's something really quite fundamental about how we think, the constraints on how we think, and how we invent the future. So that's my sort of thesis that I'm going to try and lay out. And I'm going to start with, I think, because I can't really avoid that, is the sort of really fraught question you could talk for days and days about, what is economics? Because I think you have to sort of begin a conversation like that and before you get to really what pluralist economics is. Then talk about why I think it matters, and matters a huge amount, and then end up by putting up some ideas about what you can do about it. Of course, I'm sure all of you have thought a lot about that anyway, but to throw out some ideas and maybe hopefully start a conversation that is not somehow impeded by me being behind a big lectern and staring out at you in rows, but we'll see how it goes. So if we start with what is economics, I was struck by a debate, or not a huge debate, but a few postings and discussion on your Facebook page, I think resulting from a Guardian article on a book by John Rapley, The Twilight of the Money Gods, where he sort of likens economics to a religion, which you think, bloody hell, I mean, presumably you didn't sign up to study religion here in Cambridge, did you? And I wouldn't imagine any of your lecturers would even begin to suggest that economics had anything to do with a religion at all, and it seems on the face of it, a very odd idea, though of course lots of people have likened it. And it may be noted that there is an argument to say that religion was a brilliant economic invention. Because if you imagine back in the day, when suddenly people started living in relatively large numbers compared to sort of living in a small village in settlements, suddenly they had to deal with and interact with lots of strangers. And if you're doing some sort of transaction, some sort of deal or barter or whatever it is with a stranger, of course, the fundamental problem is you don't know whether to trust them. You don't know whether they'll deliver on what they promise. You don't know whether they'll try and get one over on you. But if you know they too are a Christian, then that gives you a basis of trust. And in technical economic terms, that reduces transaction costs. And in one way of seeing economics, economics is fundamentally, or an economic system is fundamentally a way of coordinating different people's activities to produce and consume things within a society. And if you understand it that way, then transaction costs are absolutely central to the problem. And the lower your transaction costs, the more you can produce, the more you can do, the more you can work collaboratively and so forth. So in that sense, because you might think likening religion to economics seems a bit mad, but you can see religion as a huge economic invention, and the success of religions that dominate the sort of modern religions over the sort of past religions is really down to the economic success of the communities that adopted Christianity and the other modern religions that tend to have an ethical base rather than trying to explain why it's raining or not raining or whatever. So don't sort of dismiss the idea of religion as a sort of fairy tale. It clearly has important instrumental benefits. But going back to, of course, the starting point with economics, or the big attempt and the big project within economics is to make it a science. And so there's an initial question of, well, what is a science? And most people tend to sort of think of the key attribute of a science, particularly when they compare it to economics, is the ability to predict the future in some sense, in a reliable, repeatable experiments, that sort of thing. Interestingly, of course, even in science, the more you get into science, you realize that actually the observer affects the experiment, and how you measure experiments and so on actually affects how you see the results and so forth. So there is not quite that independence between the observer and the observed, which is a sort of thing that people sort of perceive that's part of science. But certainly that ability to predict, and the fact that independent of the prediction, the future still happens. So whether you understand that mixing two chemicals creates a new chemical or not makes no difference to whether that reaction happens or not. And it's regular. And of course, people have said the problem with economics is that you don't have experiments, they're not repeatable, and it's so complicated you can never really isolate what the cause and effect and so forth is, so you can never be sure, and it's very difficult to predict. And that is okay, well established. I think I'm not going to really cover that anymore. What I want to talk more about, which I think is quite particular to economics and social science more generally, is the fact that economic theory and predictions actually create the future in some sense. Not just in that they can become self-fulfilling, in that if a very influential person or people in the city say that the future is going to the housing market is going to rise in value, that will actually lead to, quite often, the housing market rising in value, because everyone says, oh, it's rising in value, let's pile into it. And so obviously the more people put money into it, the price goes up. So it sort of becomes self-fulfilling in that sense. But also it's self-fulfilling in a sort of deeper sense, in that take Friedman, for instance, who back in now my dates are probably a bit rough and right, 60s, 70s, or whatever, one of his sort of key ideas that he promoted is that managers of businesses should be solely focused on their duty to shareholders to maximize profits. Now that as an idea came out of economic theory, as it's sort of obvious that it's sort of saying that the assumptions of economics that people maximize profits then become actually a normative, a sort of requirement, or that thou shall maximize your profits. as a business person. And he also suggested that if a manager of a business did anything else, took into account any other values or objectives, there was a big problem. That would undermine the workings of the market, undermine the system, if you see what I mean. Now, interestingly, that is now taken as if that's almost a legal truth, but it's not. That actually, if you look at the duties of directors of companies in law, nowhere does it say the only duty of a director is to maximize profits to shareholders. And in a sense, shareholders don't even own companies. They have certain rights and obligations with regards to companies. But there are a lot of other people. Employees, for instance, have rights and obligations in regards to a company. Companies also have duties under all sorts of laws, health and safety, all sorts of stuff. But economics, or the theories of economics, actually created an idea that then affected how people behaved. Even though it wasn't really based in any legal truth. It then became a sort of culture or institutional or way of behaving, so that at the board table, why are we here? We're maximizing our profits. Anyone who suggested otherwise would say, well, what's the right thing to do? Well, that's not irrelevant. As long as we're within the law, we maximize our profits. That's how things are. So the theory, the ideas have actually created rules of behaving or norms for behavior where people say, okay, you may have some personal morals, personal values about what the right thing is or how to behave, protect the environment and so forth. But in a business situation, the only thing that counts is a business case. I.e., you can only do something legitimately within a business if you can show it's going to make a profit. Now that's sort of quite interesting because in normal life, of course, we're brought up to think of others, to support the family, to, if necessary, make sacrifices for the greater good, to be a good member of our society, all these sorts of things. Sorry, that's out. You go into a business, no longer. Forget that. You are here for the sole purpose of maximizing profits. So there you see a theory. It's not predicting, or it's not an experiment to see if. It's not saying people are like that. It actually has become something that says people ought to be like something. People ought to act in certain ways. And if you now suggest something that a business should do, and they say, well, it's a business case for that, we're going to make any money. I've got to answer my shareholders. Shareholders want short-term profits. Sorry, can't do that. So it's actually that sort of theory, that sort of structure is coming to a place where it just sort of determines action. So it creates the future. And of course, natural science does not create the future. It is there you are an observer. And I think that is the most important sort of difference between economics and natural science. Of course, all of social science is the same. But economics, of course, has had this incredible influence that other social sciences have not, I would say. Though maybe some social scientists would argue that in some areas it has, but of course in policy circles and so forth, social science doesn't hold a huge amount of sway. Having said all this, there's a certain urge still, I think, within us maybe, and you can see it within arguments, to think there's some sort of truth somewhere in understanding humanity, maybe human nature, or some sort of core to truth. I mean, people talk about that, don't they? The sort of economic fundamentals, and obviously within neoclassical economics we have an idea it's going to, after the exogenous shock, it will return to equilibrium. And maybe even actually people who don't accept the premises of neoclassical economics that we're fundamentally utility maximizing, self-interested individuals, will actually go the other way and say, actually, people, if you look at the history of evolution and so forth, the total success of human beings has really been down to cooperation. We are inherently cooperative, a cooperative Homo economicus. It's not Homo economicus, it's almost Homo cooperatatis. How about that? We'll work on that one. But that, fundamentally we are cooperators, and that social norms rule us. We don't get up in the morning and say, what are we going to wear? Maybe I'll just not bother with any clothes today. Maybe I'll just wear sort of flashy pink. I've always liked flashy pink. We don't sort of randomly think of all the things. We think, well, we're students. What do students wear? Or, I'm an important business person, and so I wear my suit. And I've tried to go for the pink and go for the pinks because I believe that, luckily my wife knows about these things. So, there are all sorts of rules about what you wear to look the part, to be the person. And if you start breaking them, of course, people look at you really oddly. If you just say, I just felt like it today. Yeah, but come on. We live within a society of sort of rules that set norms. And is there some truth there? And people, there are evolutionary economists who look at the fact that, say that we have still norms that go back tens of thousands of years to how we eat. Like, if we come across some ice cream, we instantaneously eat it all because we may, be hunting for some time before we find the next container of ice cream. And so we put on a huge amount of weight, mainly because of a sort of dysfunctional evolutionary sort of core thing that we can't avoid. And of course, behavioral economics looks at all sorts of sort of inbuilt irrationalities as such, and so on. But you look at it and you think, well, but it's all contingent, isn't it? It can all change. What is norm? What is the norm? What are the standards? Can be reformed and reshaped as we reshape our societies. There may be some fundamentals. Really, you have to dig pretty deep. Like, I suppose people might say that status, whatever society, there's a sort of desire for some sort of status. But there's also a desire to be one of the group. It's said that, it's much, people prefer to be wrong together than right individually. If you're wrong together, no one will blame you because, well, we all thought that. We were all wrong, tough, it's like the crash. Well, we all got it wrong. No one's got punished because, well, everyone got it wrong, so that was fine. It was fine. And then we're all together, we come out of it, and we're all still mates. If you were the one who actually were the outsider who did something different and found the right answer, well, I'm not talking to them, lucky bastard. Lose all your friends. You become isolated. If you're isolated, then evolutionarily, your chances of success are hugely reduced. But all of these things, it's very difficult to grab hold of something that's really concrete, that you can say this is something that we can really hold tight. Like, what should the value of a house be? We know that the housing market is affected by global movements of investment in the City of London, which sort of circulates, sort of ripples out. We know it's affected by the sort of idea that if you own a house, you're somehow a more whole human being. I think that's the idea. You're a proper family if you own your house, a house owner. We all want to be house owners. Why? It's just a house. It's just a lot of bricks to live in, or not bricks or wood or whatever. Why? Why do we want to own a house? Well, if you own a house, you're a real person. You've got status. You've got a person. You've made it in some sense. Well, where did that come from? You can't sort of link it to anything fundamental, fixed, or essential. And of course, that's fed into the value of houses. So, the value of housing at the moment is relative to a whole lot of totally contingent facts. Obviously, there is something about demand and supply, but why do we need that size of house we seem to want? We suddenly need kitchens that are humongous, so you can look across them, you can view, you can sit at one end of a table to the other, or maybe we don't. Some people have got to that, but all this seems highly contingent. And even if we say Brexit is somehow a sort of reaction to the fundamental inhumane nature of neoliberalism that has isolated and excluded lots of people, and therefore it's some sort of natural backlash, if you like, to a failed economic experiment. Well, you look across history and you can find lots of what Acemoglu and Robinson in their book Why Nations Fail, which is a great book, by the way, describe as extractive economic systems, i.e. economic systems that are built to basically extract wealth for the elite, they last a long time. They go on and on. They're seemingly quite stable until you get a revolution, you get the French Revolution or various things, but they haven't happened a lot. The opposite of an inclusive economy are far and few between. So which is natural? Maybe it's natural that the more powerful run the business and extract the wealth from the poor and feed them ice cream, make them feel better. So I don't know where ice cream came from, but there you go. I'm not mad on ice cream, but I do quite like a ginger and honey. Maybe we'll get some at the hall later. Anyway, so that was obviously what is economics can fill a whole lecture, and I don't pretend to have the ultimate answer. But I think first, before you get to the sort of idea of pluralism, you've got to sort of begin to understand that the whole area is a very fluid and challenging, and could be, in a sense, a religion, a way of making the future, a way of saying how people should be, which is, after all, something like a religion, but may have elements of science as well. It's flowing somewhere in between. So there, what is pluralism? Which is a bit simpler, I suppose. A bit simpler. Broadly, pluralism you can sort of, I suppose, distinguish to some extent as between a sort of static idea that at any particular moment when you're trying to understand a system that you need different ways of seeing it, different methods, different frameworks, different stories, different narratives. And here, stories about narratives, frameworks, models or whatever of how the economy works can vary from, running the country is like running a household. That's obviously what politicians tell most people. If we just keep the debt down and balance the budget, it'll all be well. Now that is clearly an economic theory. It's a model, a particular model of how the economy works, so that you can have these very sort of simplistic pictures to models that have quite a few variables, or need huge computers to run, etc., etc., etc. So there are all lots of different stories, different ways of seeing the economy. Then, of course, there's also a sort of dynamic sense in that, of course, in a pluralist economics thing, we don't want to be stuck in any particular set of stories or understanding. So the pluralism, I think, is also about ability to listen and hear and openness to different ideas, different stories, different perspectives. And that people's perspectives of how the economy works are partly a function of where they come from, what they see, the world they've grown up in, how it's affected them. I mean, obviously, if you are born into the elite as such and had a very comfortable world and lived in a nice house and been brought up and sent to private school and then to a nice place like this and end up in the city, you're going to have one picture of how, I mean, obviously from that perspective the economy is just because obviously you are superior and have got what you deserve and have worked very hard, because of course in Cambridge you have to work very hard, and everything you get, and in the city you work very long hours, and it's very tough and it's a very hard and often unpleasant place to work. So the fact that you're paid at the end of the day a few million is just absolutely deserved and really absolutely the right answer. So that is, that's, you get what you deserve. Of course, if on the other hand you were born in a different situation, in maybe a housing estate, different sort of estate, in Liverpool, for instance, where my wife was born, your picture of the world and the fact that there are another set of people who are setting the rules that are really designed to make sure you lose, and they're holding all the cards, and not only do they hold all the cards, but if you sort of go and approach them, they actually laugh at you. They find you quite amusing because you've got a sort of strange accent as they see it. They don't have an accent, by the way. I do not have an accent, just in case anyone was wondering about that. I speak proper English. Anyone else, of course, who has a different accent has an accent. This is a very important fact. So obviously people in these places have accents and are quite quirky. And my wife, who's from Liverpool, of course, had a Liverpudlian Scouse accent. And whenever she said something, and she was at Manchester University, they'd say, "Gosh, can you say that again?" You speak in a really fun way. Of course, she had to get rid of her accent because no one actually listened to anything she said because they were just finding her accent quite amusing. So, you get a totally different perspective of what the economy looks like. So, allowing different pictures, allowing space for different ideas must be essential to pluralism. In terms of sort of analytical, I mean, I don't know how aware you are of different economic methods or traditions. And people are often surprised by the range of them, and they're very different perspectives on how the world works. And I suppose I've hinted at some of them, but I mean, you can easily, list about 8 or 9. I mean, I go behavioral economics, complexity economics, institutional economics, feminist economics, ecological economics, post-Keynesian economics. What else? Marxist economics. I've done institutional economics. Anyway, there are a whole range of them, and they come from labour economics. I'm not sure. They come from a lot of different perspectives. I mean, the most familiar one might be behavioural economics, the nudge. Well, of course, the Nobel laureate that was announced on Monday, Thaler, who invented nudge theory, which was actually a development of an earlier Nobel economist, Danny Kahneman, who wrote Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, both really worth reading. And they discovered people were stupid, which is also, I always find quite amusing, because I think economists always really believed people were stupid anyway, because of course they were the clever ones. But they had a theory that said that they were rational, optimizing, incredibly brainy, and so forth. So there was some sort of level of relief when behavioral economics sort of discovered they were stupid. But of course, behavioral economics sort of systematized that into various biases compared to this ideal of a rational homo economicus. And obviously lots of experiments, and that's interesting because experiments, even though, having discussed social science and economics, they're not really a science, of course there's been a huge interest in doing experiments, and you'll probably be asked to, usually on students because they're quite cheap, to conduct experiments. All you need is a lab, a few computers, and some willing students who are willing to, who are a bit short of money and are willing to be paid very little for spending the day playing on a computer. What could be wrong with that? So, so most of the economic experiments, most of the economic results in behavioral economics from experimental economics are actually the behavior of students in labs in front of computers who are trying to make a few bob to afford a pint that night. So whether that makes any difference to the results, I'm not sure. But they're certainly clearly loss averse, amongst other things, which may or may not make sense. So behavioral economics has been very influential, as we see Nobel economists, and quite influential in policy, because there is a desire in policy particularly to understand a certain amount better how people really act. Then we've got, I think, quite an interesting strand of economics called institutional economics, which actually goes back to the 1930s, has a very long tradition with some big players in it who also, quite a few got Nobel Prizes as well. Coase theory, people will hear about that. Quite a lot of focus on transaction costs, which I sort of mentioned in the context of religion. But a range of ideas, some nearer to neoclassical economics and some further from that. And actually, one of the leading international lights is a guy called Jeff Hodgson, who is a sort of international leader in institutional economics. They're quite often interested in history, which obviously marks them out from neoclassical economics. So a recent article, for instance, which is actually summarized in the Mint magazine with a sort of link to the academic article, was about 1688 and all that. Which basically tells the story of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And the thesis of Jeff Jeffrey Hodgson is that it was actually financial innovation, the creation of the Bank of England, and which was all came from the Netherlands, because of course in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which you'll all know about, William Orange came over, and the people he brought with him were the current leading edge financial innovators, because Amsterdam had been the centre of financial innovation. The beginners in financial innovation had been Venice, but they had sort of fallen away, and they'd lost their inclusive economic status, according to Acemoglu, and the sort of baton had passed, and the centre of financial innovation was in Amsterdam. But of course, once the king left to go and take over the neighbouring throne, they moved with him. And so Jeffrey Hodgson's argument is that actually the Industrial Revolution owes totally to the financial innovators who moved to the UK and basically allowed the aristocracy to turn their land wealth into capital to fund the Industrial Revolution by creating banks and creating all the sort of mechanisms that allowed that capital to be transferred. So that interest in the rules and institutions is an interesting word, which is important to understand, because a lot of people think an institution is an organisation. And it is true that organisations are a type of institution. But the technical term institution is much wider. It basically indicates a set of formal or informal rules that usually are associated with a set of values, and people who identify those values follows those rules. So religion in that sense is an institution, in that it has a set of values, a set of informal and formal rules, and people ascribe to it and identify with it. So is a club. So is neoliberalism. So is economics. Every economics theory has a set of people who have subscribed to it, believe in it, follow a set of rules of how they behave and what is acceptable and what is unacceptable within those terms. There's a great book by a US writer who writes about pluralist economics and doesn't just analyse the theories, the different schools of thoughts, but also looks at the behaviour and what it takes to be a member of a club. And each of the economic methods are associated, if you like, with a club. Effectively a set of people who ascribe, who get together and join, and there are certain behaviours that are acceptable, certain beliefs that are reasonable to hold and stay in the club. If you start straying too much, you get kicked out, basically. You're no longer an acceptable member of the club. So if you are a neoclassical economist and are making your way up the greasy pole to success as a professor and so forth, there are certain things expected of you, certain behaviours and certain things that if you do, lose you your job or lose you your status at least. And so this actually is, I must find this book, the guy talks about sort of the medical profession as an example and what people can get away with and not, and says, for instance, a doctor, as long as generally they ascribe to standard medicine, can also say, well, there's this homeopathic cure, why not try this as well, because I don't know whether it'll work, but the mainstream stuff has had not great results, so throw this in as well. And that would be considered nowadays sort of acceptable. Probably 20 or 30 years, probably not. But thanks to Prince Charles, probably, they're now sort of allowed to get away with it. If they started greeting their patients naked, that probably would mean they're out, just like that. If they started only prescribing homeopathic medicines, probably they'd lose their job as well. So you can look and say, well, how far can you go outside the boundaries? And also that, of course, if you're considered brilliant and have very high status and a top of the tree, you can also jump out of the tree to a greater extent, if you see what I mean, in that if you do strange and eccentric things and you're a Nobel Prize winner, well, you could probably get away with it for some time until they sort of lock you away. So understanding institutions, rules of behaviour. So suddenly we move, so you can see neoclassical economics all about individuals, preferences are fixed, they're just coming from the individual. You are isolated from society. Behavioral economics, you're also isolated from society, but a bit stupid. Institutional economics, your thoughts, desires, behavior, all shaped by the institutions, the clubs, the rules that you ascribe to. Of course, you can also affect those, you can rebel against them. I think a lot of people in this room are currently rebelling against an institution and trying to change it. So you as individuals have taken that power and set up your own institution, which is maybe we call pluralist economics, for want of a better word, and forming a club. And there's maybe, if you look around the pluralist economics community, there's probably also accepted ways of behaving, sets of beliefs, identity, and so on. Just another example, complexity economics. Complexity economics really, I think, came out of largely physics and mathematicians, because interestingly, what had happened in that economics had become slightly isolated as a discipline from developments in physics and mathematics, even though its core sort of basis and origins go back to looking at physics and mathematics for inspiration. So suddenly the people in that sort of space looked at economics and said, well, your maths is out of date, your models are out of date, we'll come and sort you out. And so like Doane Farmer at INET, Institution for New Economic Thinking at Oxford, was originally a physicist. And he's now an agent-based modeler in complexity economics. I think he's director of complexity economics at the Institute for New Economic Thinking. And that sort of picture sees the world as a complex, interacting set of individuals, and emphasis on modeling complex interactions over time, non-linearity, crowd behavior, collapses, crashes, all these sorts of things. But very much from a sort of, the model is there. I always picture complexity economists seeing the economy here and trying to model it. They are not actually in the economy, I think, in a sense, because they tend to be more in a space of seeing it as a sort of physical system that they're modeling, and seeing it, they tend to see it more towards a science, and they're doing better science than neoclassical economists, who they tend to see as doing rubbish science. So they see themselves in the same sort of scientific paradigm, whereas institutional economists, they see the system much more broadly, and they see themselves more as inside the system. Interestingly, the parts of the policy community that are taking up different ways of using economics are much more comfortable with complexity economics than institutional economics. And institutional economics is right on the outers. It's hardly taught, and it's hardly referred to or used in policy circles. And the reason is, I think, that the policy sort of system itself has certain rules. Civil servants, I'm a civil servant, totally neutral, objective, scientific. I take evidence from out there of how the world is, and I give advice to ministers who are very wise, and they work out the costs and benefits and come to conclusions which they then provide out of their graciousness and wonderment to the general population. And of course, I do not have a political thought in my head, and I'm totally scientific, so complexity economics works for me, because I can say, well, this is a science, and we're understanding how the world works, and we're advising you, Minister, with a better set of science than previously. If, on the other hand, I went to a minister and said, well, there's this institution called neoliberalism that is dominating the way you think about the world. Now, I made a big mistake there. I said dominating the way you think. No, sorry, I cannot, as a civil servant, suggest that my minister, who is very wise and objective and so forth, is being dominated or affected by an institution. I can't suggest that he is part of the model, that he is actually part of the system. No, he is above it and looking at it, making wise decisions and policy for the people. So you can see that a way of seeing economics which is more scientific fits that sort of representative ministerial government much more sort of easily. And the OECD, for instance, loves agent-based modelling, complexity economics, and all that sort of stuff. Bank of England, obviously, Andy Haldane, big into agent-based modelling and complexity economics and so on. But institutional economics, feminist economics, I don't think we go near that. Sounds very dicey. Marxist economics, well, come on. So when you're in pluralist economics, of course, again, you have rules into which society, and depending where you are, what is polite and what is impolite. And in polite policy circles, talking about complexity economics and behavioral economics, fine. If you start getting into Marxist economics and institutional economics, then you're really getting into dangerous waters. So you need to understand that pluralist economics is itself different camps, different ways of seeing things that are used or acceptable or unacceptable. But at least there is different ways, there's different perspectives of how the world might work. And at the very least, you can sort of bring it together and say, if the world is complex and there is no probably right answers, at least if we sort of try and understand how different people see it and how it may work in different ways, we're not sure how, but we look at different scenarios and we use a modeling platform that can represent these different views, well, we're probably in a better place. Even if, of course, at the end of the day, there are always constraints over what is polite, what is allowed in different circles. So why does this matter? Of course, the starting point for the student movement back in the day was that they felt there was a total disjunction between what they were being taught and the world outside, and it didn't seem to give them any perspective or understanding or grasp of what was really happening. And obviously that seems to be a problem. I mean, the other way of looking at this, actually, I was told this. It's told me, I can't remember who told me it, but it was apparently said by a professor of economics at, in the US. He basically said, what's your problem? People who do economics get better jobs, get better paid. Professors of economics get better paid than any other professor. Why are you worried that it has anything to do with the world or not? And after all, I don't know, how many people have studied Latin? Okay. So Latin, very good training of the mind. If you can do Latin, you're a good thinker. I'll employ you. But you wouldn't sort of go out there and start speaking Latin to anyone, I don't think, would you? I've forgotten it. I studied Latin from age 8 to age 15, and I cannot remember anything really. And it was part of my life for a very long time. But there, Latin was taught. It's still taught, obviously, and I mean, it used to be obviously used as a language. I don't know when it died. I think 16th century or something. It stopped being something like that. Stopped being used as a language to communicate across Europe. But it still went on as being taught as a training of the mind. So maybe we should see neoclassical economics as a bit like Latin. It trains your mind, gives you analytical techniques, and you really shouldn't worry about the fact that whether it represents or gives you any insight into reality or not. Of course, that seems a bit of a strange position to be in, but that could go on. You keep getting jobs, you forget all this pluralist rubbish that was just the youthful discretion, and go and get a job in the city and do the right thing, and you don't have to worry about anything. Policy. Of course, policy, you can't really quite make that argument on the face of it, because real people are obviously affected by policy, and if you design policy on the basis of ideas about the world, or it can negatively affect people. So in policy, I suppose the examples of that are privatization. Obviously, privatization and outsourcing have all been driven by economic theory. Markets are more efficient, therefore if we get private sector to take over what the public sector does, it'll all work out much better. We get more efficient outcomes and so on. And that obviously has been a theory that has had huge effects. Now, unfortunately, one of the key sort of holes in the sort of neoclassical economic sort of framework was an understanding of the finance sector, because basically because you can see markets as just bartering and money just being a form of exchange, you don't have to worry about debt and the finance sector or the relationships that creates or anything like that. So when they were thinking and recommending to ministers in a totally objective and scientific manner what should be done to public services, they went on the basic economics, marketing, privatization would make them more efficient. They didn't say, oh, and of course, they will then be financed by the finance sector who are incredibly inventive, and actually they're actually a lot more innovative than the people who run the companies. So if you take the water industry, for instance, the water industry, a lot of the innovation there has happened in the financial arrangements as much, or some people argue more so, than actually in the delivery of water itself. So in terms of putting complex financing arrangements and so forth to maximize returns, there's been huge innovation. Because obviously incentives work all sorts of ways, and so there's obviously an incentive to maximize returns, to innovate in, if you can get a way, make more money by innovating the financial aspects, then that's a better example, but a better way of doing it, much easier, than actually finding a better way to deliver water to people. And there have been also examples in care homes and so forth of complex financial arrangements of high gearing, bringing risk, all these aspects, which, as far as I'm aware, were never really factored in to the original advice and thinking about privatization. There's a very interesting work done in Manchester University by the Centre CRESC, I can't remember what it stands for, but looking at the sort of dynamics of the outsourcing industry with these big companies that have been set up just to outsource, who do a multitude of different activities all around just whatever's outsourced, and their key skill is actually bidding for contracts. But this sort of turnover and rollover of personnel actually leads to, or can lead to, a reduction in skills, a reduction in ability, and they're very good at winning contracts, but just because you're good at winning contracts doesn't mean you're necessarily good at delivering the services, particularly if the core skill is bidding for contracts successfully, whatever the service is. So the question of actually providing a quality service is a totally secondary thing. And also because it's about winning contracts and keeping contracts, then you've lost it, and you've lost that set of skills, you move on and win something else. But there's some very interesting reviews of the skills of these companies in terms of winning contracts and making or not making money, actually, that they've also had a lot of sort of up and downside, and also the sort of arguments around the displacement of skills and the fact that and the lack of maybe the classic cleaning of hospitals, the fact that outsourcing cleaners has been argued that then the cleaners didn't really feel that they cared about the hospital. They were somehow detached. They were not part of the institution of the hospital, and therefore they didn't have the sort of intrinsic desire to clean the hospital. Because, of course, intrinsic beliefs and being part of a hospital is not an idea. That is a sort of institutional, social idea. It's not an idea in mainstream economics. So by not seeing aspects of a problem, you can end up with policy outcomes that are deeply problematic in terms of their outcomes, because you have not factored in aspects of humanity and what makes things work. And what I suppose mainstream economics has done is focused mainly on the institution of markets without thinking of all the other institutions such as values, clubs, identity, all sorts of other things that affect human beings to a greater or lesser extent. People wanting to be part of something because it's conceived of people as totally individuals, as self-interested, and only motivated by reward from outside, having no sort of internal drivers, intrinsic sort of beliefs and values. So you can get outcomes that are problematic. Actually, another good example of where misunderstandings or not seeing things as they are and can make a difference is money. Money is a fascinating thing. Anyone bought a Bitcoin recently? How are you doing? How's it going for you? Oh, good. You may be unusual there. That Bitcoins are fascinating because it is claimed by some, depending on how you think of money, as reflecting a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of money. Because Bitcoin is based on the idea that money is about scarcity. that if you create something that's scarce, then that can become a currency. Whereas, which is a sort of mainstream economics, neoclassical economics sort of perspective, whereas if you take an institutional perspective, money is actually just a relationship. It's about someone promising to pay someone else. It's just a variant of a debt, a sort of debtor and a lender. And so money is all about the institutions, the arrangements to ensure that that bit of paper, that IOU or note or contract to pay or whatever it is actually enforceable, and you will get paid. And the confidence in a currency is totally about the institutions. And so there are a lot of countries where currencies just doesn't work, that actually ceases to function because it no longer has the institutional underpinning and the trust and so forth, so it's just worthless. And people resort to the dollar and so forth, which has the institutional backing. So, not taking into account aspects of systems from a policy perspective can have big implications. And I'm told that the Bitcoin, I would leave it. I would get rid of them very quickly. But there's also, I think, the personal and political. I think strong ideas, like religions, like the sort of economic ideas, take hold of our minds, constrain how we think. You can see that in companies, people go into business and they accept that when they cross the threshold, when they leave home, arrive at work, they have to act in a different way which is appropriate to the setting. And they're not necessarily aware of it. And so there are rules about business cases, about everything having to be profitable, or whatever a situation is. But that can actually constrain how you think, constrain the possibilities. And that is, I think, both personal in terms of constraining the possibilities in your life, because you become conditioned. You have to consume in certain ways. You have to be a good consumer, a rational consumer. You have to be self-interested. You have, that actually form who you are. So I think part of pluralism is actually rebelling against those set ideas, that set way that can constrain our thinking. Politically, of course, it constrains how we imagine the future. And if we think of the challenges, obviously the ecological challenges, climate change and so forth, and we say, well, we can't afford to address climate change. Sorry. Unfortunately, because of our economic principles and the way we run our economy, it's too expensive to save ourselves. We are, tough. Sorry about that. But we've got a system, we've got economic rules, we've got an economic system, and climate change doesn't work for us. Let's deny it. That's the solution. And remember that one of the rules in psychology, one of the key rules in psychology is that if you've got a choice between believing something and not believing something, the fundamental determinant of whether you believe it or not is actually relates to your own situation and whether you can sort of cope with the belief. If the belief affects your world and your life and you have to do something different, then you're more likely to disbelieve it. And the actual truth, whether it's true in any sense or not, or the evidence is a minor issue. So obviously people who have guns and like shooting things and are part of the Republican Party will believe deeply that the answer to baddies who have guns are goodies who have guns too. And people believe sincerely and deeply these things because, of course, it fits in with their life and their worldview and so on. So pluralism is about breaking out and challenging and criticizing and trying to understand your own beliefs, your own perspectives. And that is true. And this is where I sort of come back to the fact that it is like a social movement. If you look at all the social movements, take feminism to start with. The first steps, and of course as a man I'm treading on challenging ground here, but the first steps in feminism was understanding the hidden chains, the stuff people took for granted. That women were relatively stupid, That's just how it was, and couldn't do various things, were physically incapable of doing various things. That was just how things were, and of course the power of that was to such an extent that even though in the Second World War and the First World War actually, which I only learnt recently, women went out and did everything that men had done, because of course the men were off killing each other. They went back. There was a huge campaign and push to put women back exactly where they were before. So they spent 4 years or whatever showing that they could do everything probably better than the men who were sent off to war. And then there were campaigns and pressure and social pressure to put women back into where they'd come from, back into the roles, back into the kitchen, if you like. Of course, those experiences did raise awareness and then clearly led to change. But it was that sort of discovery, that awareness to start with, of that the norms, that the oppressive norms were just inventions. They weren't factual, they didn't really exist in anything real. They were just mechanisms by one sector of society to constrain and oppress another sector of the society. And, you know, we see it under the gay movement, gay pride. Feeling that you can be gay and have pride. Obviously that's a key idea. Whereas before, if you were gay, you were unnatural. You were somehow deformed. You had a guilty secret. You had to hide it. I think pluralism, again, is in that same space by finding different ways of seeing, different ways of thinking, escaping from the constraints of thinking that we've been brought into. So what can you do about it? Well, obviously, being here is a good start. Getting aware, trying to understand that, trying to become more self-aware. I think all these things start with your own, thinking about yourself and how you see the world, your perspective on what you want to do in the world, how your values. Because only if you sort of can understand yourself and how you're affected by the society you're in, can you begin to look at others and look at the system. So I think starting with yourself is really important. But obviously then looking at society, reading and being critical. I suppose the key thing that monism, or sort of an enforcement of a particular way of seeing things, is that it squashes criticism. It forces you to accept various things and punishes you in a sense if you question, by obviously not giving you any marks, not recognizing it as valid comment, looking at you strangely as if you were slightly mad. These are all social means, so being aware of that and actually calling it out. If you feel that your ideas are being ignored, well, say that. Point it out, because a lot of these constraints are hidden and not mentioned, and that very fact is why they continue. Then, of course, learn about how this affects real policy, because I think this movement is going to succeed if people see, if you like, join the dots between how you think about the economy, the theories and ideas, and the impacts in the real world. An academic debate between students and lecturers about what they should be taught. On the face of it, who cares about that? It doesn't really, it seems to be, it's just happening here. It doesn't really matter to most people. So making it matter, showing how it actually affects the real world, how it has affected the real world, is absolutely key. And I'll just end with, I think, something that I was really struck by seeing a film called The Four Horsemen, which is the less well-known sort of film that came out of the crash. It's obviously Boom, Bust, Bang, Boom, Bust, Boom, that is relatively well-known with Monty Python. But there was also the Four Horses, and it starts with a comment by a woman called Gillian Tett. Gillian Tett is the managing director. She's either managing director or chief executive or something like that of the Financial Times. So Financial Times, yeah. If anything's sort of core and standard and the sort of center of the universe, Financial Times must be close to it. She's based in the US, and in a sort of early bit of this film, she said, power is about controlling the cognitive map. Power is about controlling the cognitive map. And I think that is why pluralist economics is so subversive, because it is actually challenging the cognitive map that the powerful control and use to run the world. More or less, probably not all the world, but quite a lot of it. So this is, as said by the managing director of the FT, a very important enterprise. Thank you.
Which classical economics completely ignores, or adding temporal values to dynamic systems which would create disequilibrium dynamics, which obviously diverge from the results of neoclassical theory in the realm of the market. So shouldn't you also focus, in fact, a lot more heavily on the area neoclassical economics seems to master, rather than just the other aspects which they will then dismiss as, oh yeah, sure, you can talk about the other areas, but our field still has some relevance because we are the masters of this particular area?
Well, I suppose it's interesting because that suggests that science is about having a method and saying, right, we're going to stick, our method says these little bits and it's internally consistent, rigorous, and so tell us what's wrong with that. We just do this and it all works and it produces results and so on. And I suppose what I'm saying is actually, which maybe I should have emphasized more, is that I think you have to start with the phenomena that you're trying to understand and think what might help you understand it. And actually, this is precisely the approach that the new ESRC-funded centre, the ESRC is the government funding mechanism for economic research, that's called Rebuilding Macroeconomics, which has come out of, which has been I suppose the first major move, if you like, by the economics establishment after the crash, which has just started, was launched actually on the 13th of September. And this is meant to rethink how macroeconomics can be. And one of the fundamental things that they have said, first, the SRC said clearly that actually they wanted a network to understand the macroeconomy, i.e. that you should start with the phenomena and then decide how you might try and understand it. And they have in their centre anthropologists, historians, they have a whole range of disciplines, and they have complexity economists and so forth, because the approach they're saying is actually we have a complex phenomena and there are different ways, and to understand it we need to look a lot. We can't just say, well, we've taken a little bit and we've taken our bit and we've things and it all works as that, so come and tell us what's wrong with our internal consistency, because there are things wrong with it, but that's another story. But pluralist economics is a different approach where you actually start, which could be said to be a normal scientific approach. You start with the phenomena that you're trying to understand and see what matters, see what's the crucial bits. And if it is the case that institutions are important, and I would say, Brexit, Trump and so forth, just imagine the costs of Brexit, the transaction costs of Brexit alone are going to be absolutely humongous. Why did Brexit happen? Because I think, it's a reasonably good argument that there was an institutional breakdown. So a major economic phenomenon can really only be explained from an institutional perspective. So if you start and say, well, we don't deal with institutions, we're not going to look at that. I mean, you're saying that we're going to deal with this problem, trying to understand this system, but we're going to say we're going to ignore, we're not even going to prove that they're not relevant, we're going to ignore various parts of the system, a priori, and just use this. And that's just what we do. That's what we understand, and so we're going to try and understand a system based on what we understand, not based on the system and what might be relevant to the system. And so, no, I think saying we have to prove you somehow wrong in some sense, or is totally not the way, and is fundamentally unscientific.
Okay, I want to ask you about Bitcoin, because you mentioned it.
About
Bitcoin.
Oh, right, okay.
Because you said about other currencies that they are based, their quality and their desirability is based on the institutions backing transfers in that currency.
Yeah.
And if there's a breakdown in those institutions in some parts of the world, people will not tend to use that money. And they will go to more reliable institutions.
Yeah.
And Bitcoin is, in my opinion, based on the idea that the most reliable institution is actually a computer algorithm, that it isn't based on trust in one single institution or a person, so that it is much more reliable than institutions backed by governments or banks or something like that. So your comment about trying to get rid of Bitcoin doesn't really make sense to me, because that's what you had said before, that it was the biggest quality of money in general.
Well, I don't think blockchain meets the criteria of being an institution in a sense, and I would suggest that it still would need enforcement mechanisms, and if there are disputes, or if I fail to pay or whatever, then what happens? And the point about money is that there is recourse, there is a way of challenging if someone doesn't pay or doesn't meet their obligations. And it's backed by something. I mean, I don't know. I am somewhat here. I will refer you to Anne Pettifor for a further detailed argument on this. I'm sort of quoting somewhat from her. She wrote the production of money, taking control more of banks or something like that, and she goes through the whole history of currency, and it's her, her perspective, which is now generally sort of taken up. The Bank of England certainly accept that. This picture of money, and the implications of it is that Bitcoin is not actually money. Anne Pettifor. She appears in the second issue of the Mint magazine. You can read an interview with her and find out more. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for coming to speak to us. So, given there's so many different views, perspectives, schools of thought that you mentioned listed as endless, is there a need for a unifying theory? And specifically, could that unifying theory be behind the school of happiness economics, where the one thing, your perspective, is that we all want to pursue happiness, and the government's role should be to facilitate that. So yeah, I guess it's 2 points. Is there a need for unifying theory, and could it, with all of these different perspectives, be happiness and well-being?
Well, one, I'm not absolutely sure, but I tend towards the fact that there doesn't need to be a unifying theory, and actually there almost can't be a unifying theory, and that because people's perspectives will be relevant to their position in society, whatever that is, from whatever dimension you want to suggest, because of that. In economics, theories tend to have normative implications, and of course that is always disputed. So I think a single unifying theory is actually, going back to the Gillian Tett, is moving you to some extent towards in a direction of a totalitarianism, because it's inimical to democracy, because for a start, because and that's what you can see how economics has technicalized democracy. And that's obviously one of the claims of the student movement, which I think is absolutely right, that economics has been used to technicalize political decisions and to alienate people from them so they can't understand them. And so once there is only one right answer, you don't need democracy. And once you can also, more importantly, of course, not convince people that there is only one way of seeing the economy, there is only one way of running it, and they accept that is a way to control. So if you create a new one, then there's no reason why that is just another version, another thing that will benefit various people. In terms of happiness economics, that is hugely disputable. I mean, the fact that we aim for happiness, I mean, there's a huge literature that questions that. You can have all sorts of objectives in life: self-actualization, doing your duty to family, helping your whatever group it is succeed, take control. I think it's very unlikely. I mean, even if you take very rich people, it seems very unlikely to be able to explain that they're aiming for happiness. I mean, you'd think if that was true, once you had your first few million, you'd retire, wouldn't you, and have a nice time playing golf. Actually, the much more easy explanation is that they're aiming for status. And once you've got a Forbes list and you're 15th, you want to be 5th, and then you want to be 1st. I would think, the concept of aiming for happiness, I think, is hugely debatable. And there's lots of debates about what happiness is. It's a transitory feeling that you might get now and again. So do we have happiness versus contentment? Is contentment just coming to terms with where you are in life? A sort of Buddhist concept. It doesn't, I don't think saying there's the economics of happiness, that must be, does not, I think, answer, it doesn't close the debate, it opens it up. And it's also totally outcome basis, so it's in the sort of field of ethics of sort of utilitarianism, which is akin, obviously, a sort of relative to preference-based utilitarianism in economics, rather than procedural ethics, which is actually about doing the right thing. And given, if you take complexity seriously, we have no idea what a lot of our actions will lead to, happiness or unhappiness. You marry someone, is that going to lead to happiness or unhappiness? You have no idea. The complexity is enormous. You have no idea. You do the right thing. You believe something. You have a commitment. You have a relationship. You value, all sorts of things. And actually, I think one of the implications of really understanding and taking seriously complexity and uncertainty, which are the key aspects that tend to be ignored, is that actually it comes down to maybe that the key thing we should do is try to do the right thing in some sense, in terms of acting, rather than be all the time thinking about what the outcome might be, because we have no idea what the outcome might be.
I have a question regarding something you said at the beginning, that about managers and profits, seeking profits. I'm not sure I understood correctly, but if you could clarify, that would be great. The manager, in my opinion, is an employee of the shareholders, so they cannot do whatever they would like to do, but only what their job is. And what their job is whatever the actual owners or the decision makers of the company what they want. So if they want profits, his job is going to be for profits. If they want environmental protection, it's going to be environmental protection. But the manager himself is not the king who would be there to make that decision. He's just an employee.
But he's not an employee of the shareholders. He's an employee of the company. And the shareholders don't own the company in a sense of, I own this. They have certain rights and obligations with regards to that company. The situation is a lot more complex. It tends to be simplified to justify the story that you actually tell. Managers of companies have rights and obligations to a whole range of different people, including the employees. Now, clearly, there are issues about the structure of companies that I think tend to reinforce the sort of institutional perspective that economics has given to private companies. But actually, if you look at the law, I mean, lawyers have been growing in their sort of fight back against economists, pointing out that the economics theory version of a company and the rights and obligations actually does not reflect the legal reality at all. So there is then a question, well, what are the rights and obligations and what should they be? And also, there is obviously a question of power and control and what power and control shareholders do or don't have. I mean, interestingly, I think a lot of people would claim that shareholders have very little control over companies, mainly because they're very diffuse, and it's actually management of companies, most companies, that control them, and that they obviously control their bonuses, and there's an interlocking web of people who decide who earns what, and so you could put a very good argument to say that the people who actually control private companies to a large extent are the senior managers, are the CEOs. Is that right? But I mean, it's worth understanding. You have to be very aware of theoretical concepts of reality. You actually have to look at the real dynamics and how things really work, and the law. And of course, the law is different from the reality. And the reality is different from the regulations. So, how bonuses are organized and meant theoretically to work or in procedure is not necessarily how they actually work. How people respond to bonuses is also not in line with how you might expect it. When someone gets a bonus, the first thing they do is find out what everyone else got. You think, right, well, happiness. Who's the happiness idea? I'm going to give you £1 million because you've been fantastic. How do you feel? Do you feel happy?
Great.
You'd like £1 million? Your mate who sits by you, you go back and discover he got 1.2 million. How do you feel now?
That's great.
And actually, people don't care about the million. They care about the 1.2. And especially if they're their neighbour, and they look at that guy and say, what did he do? They don't care about me, and they don't like me. I'm out. You have to look at the reality. You have to look at the actual dynamics. You have to look about how people react and the stories that they're told and the narratives and who gains and who loses. Yeah?
So I was just wondering, because you have been very negative on the happiness economics. If we think about it like more broadly and take the term well-being, right, which now in this situation is not just seeing subjective well-being measures, which we normally tend to do with happiness, but rather look like well-being in the sense that we can define in terms of educational outcomes, health outcomes, people's feeling of safety, social connections. For example, the OECD has the Better Life Initiative, which takes a very multidimensional approach to well-being. Because I think also what you were suggesting with your example of the shareholders and the manager, you are to some degree suggesting that we need to broaden our metrics, right? We need to look at different measures, like not just focus, for example, on profit or GDP, like having a more pluralist idea of the measures we value, especially in policy making, is probably also a step forward, and having probably a public discourse as a country or a city. I guess a lot of these things could happen more on the local level on what we value in our communities, what is important to us. All of that is, I think, an important part, right, of moving forward.
I'm challenging. You're a load of bright students, so my sort of objective is to unsettle you and undermine your beliefs so that you'll go and try and re-justify them or question them or whatever. So I'm not saying that thinking about well-being and thinking about a broader sort of indicators is not not a good thing. The question is it everything? And so I suppose what I'm challenging is whether that is in some sense the answer. I think it's maybe a part of the answer. But one thing, if you go back to one of the sort of key, I think it's a management idea, is the idea of leading and lagging indicators. Lagging indicators are things like profits, well-being, stuff that happens after the event down the track, as opposed to leading indicators, which are things that you're doing sort of here and now, if you like, which will lead to some outcomes. And all companies usually, for instance, have some theories or some ideas about what their leading indicators should be in terms of how they relate to the lagging indicators. you cannot run a company, you cannot run a world, you cannot run yourself or whatever based on lagging indicators. By the time you get to them and discover that they're wrong, it's too late. So you have to have, you have to get up you have to get out of bed in the morning. That's a leading indicator, I think, of the fact that you have probably going to have a happy and sustainable life, is that you can actually get up in the morning. You have, if people live in a house which is chaotic and mess and nothing's washed up and so forth, that's a leading indicator that probably that there's a fairly dysfunctional relationships and a lack of self-worth and so forth. Maybe, yeah. People wouldn't dispute that. Some people are quite happy with living in chaos, but in general they're probably not. So the question of then the relationship between leading indicators and lagging indicators is really complicated, because just because you get your house into shipshape and tidiness, etc., doesn't mean that you suddenly feel in control and so forth. Just because you get up in the morning, every morning at a decent time, doesn't mean that you don't become a deeply unhappy, dysfunctional, suicidal, middle-aged person doing a job they hate. Getting those leading indicators of what a right and proper life is, what sort of relationships, how you behave on a day-to-day basis, is probably more important. Whether, we might have a third world war in 5 years' time, and we might have all tried our best and we'll all get killed. And that's a pity. We won't, of course, experience it or know the results. But on the other hand, it doesn't stop us trying to do, we don't want to, if we said, well, it's looking all pretty bleak, ecological disaster, social desiccation, North Korea, it's all, if we just think about the outcomes, we won't get up in the morning, and they'll become, if you like, self-fulfilling. So in a way, I would say the focus needs to be on how you live your life on a day-to-day basis, rather than some sort of theoretical concept down the space of what a lovely place might be. But of course, there has to be some sort of relationship between those two, I guess. So you need both of them. So I would say, if you're planning any set of, if you look at, actually, and companies do that, if you look at the sort of indicators, or they have both some sort of outcome indicators, and then you have, well, how do we behave? How do we relate to each other? How do we talk to each other? How do we give space to people? How are we inclusive? Do we involve people? Do we put men in suits with ties all the time in front of lots of people to tell them how to think? That's a sort of indicator. Here we are in a sort of abusive relationship where I'm dictating to you how to think and forcing you by looking superior and important and pretending to know stuff to sort of manipulate your minds to etc. Maybe that's not a good thing. But I happen to be given a podium and it's quite fun and it's Cambridge. What the hell? That's my excuse.
And for one more really quick question, if there's any. Okay. Thank you very much, Henry.